I have worked for the Duke of Thornville for 31 years, and in all that time I have kept his secrets the way a stone wall keeps out the cold, without complaint, without question, and without opening so much as a hairline crack to let the weather through. My name is Halford. I came to Thornville Hall as a young footman at the age of 17, was made under steward at 23, and have served as head steward since the year the old Duke died and his son Edmund Ashcroft inherited the title. The estate, the tenants, the accounts, and the particular brand of sorrow that seems to run in the Ashcroft blood like a river that never quite finds its mouth. I have kept many secrets in 31 years. I have kept the secret of the East Wing flooding, which the late Duke refused to address for a decade because it had begun to flood during the summer of the year his wife died, and he could not somehow bring himself to change anything. I have kept the secret of the cook's sister, who appeared at the kitchen door in the small hours of the morning 3 or 4 times a year and was always quietly fed and sent away, and who never caused any trouble, and whose story I guessed at and kept entirely to myself. I have kept the secret of the former housekeeper's drinking, which had grown quietly catastrophic before I found her a dignified position in her niece's household, and replaced her before the wine inventory became undeniable. I have kept a letter of credit signed by the late Duke on behalf of a nephew who had shown every sign of becoming a calamity, and who had, true to form, become one. I am a man built for discretion, and I wear that quality the way other men wear a signet ring, always, and with a certain private satisfaction. It is not a glamorous virtue, but it is a real one, and I have never been tempted to abandon it for any short-term relief. There is, however, one thing I carried for 12 years that weighed differently than all the rest. Not because I chose to carry it, I did not know it, until the night I am about to describe, but because, once I knew it, holding it for even a single additional hour felt like carrying a stone that belonged to someone else. I had not put it down carefully, the way I put down the other things. I had not set it in the back of a cupboard and walked away. I had simply picked it up without knowing what it was, and now I had to do something with it, and the only right thing was to give it to the man it properly belonged to. That night I did not sleep. I rode through the dark at an age when men of my station are generally found beside a fire with their feet elevated, and I delivered the truth to the man who needed it most. I will tell you everything, but first I must tell you about Miss Elspeth Crane. She came to Thornville Hall in the autumn of the year the Duke turned 32, the autumn his mother finally prevailed upon him to consider a suitable match. The Dowager Duchess was a woman of formidable patience, a very long memory for social obligation, and the implacable determination of someone who has watched a son grow into exactly the kind of man she hoped he would be, and is now quietly beside herself about the fact that he is doing it alone. She had been cataloging suitable young women for the better part of a decade. She presented them to the Duke one by one, at dinners and musicales and the occasional house party, and he received them all with the same expression of polite, impenetrable boredom that I had come to think of as his public face. The most feared Duke of 3 counties, they called him. Cold, unreachable. A man who had inherited his father's reserve without inheriting the faint warmth that had, at intervals, softened it. He was not without feeling. I knew this because I had worked beside him for 30 years, and I had seen what was there in the private moments. In the early morning, when he walked the south field alone in a way that had nothing to do with inspection, and everything to do with simply needing to be outside. In the way he spoke to the older tenants, which was different in quality from the way he spoke to anyone else, more patient, more present. In the small rituals he had maintained from his childhood without ever explaining them, because rituals of that kind do not require explanation, they require only the quiet continuity of being kept. He cared deeply about this land and the people on it. He read voraciously and remembered everything. He had a clumsy, genuine tenderness with the horses in his stables that he would have been embarrassed to have noticed. But none of this was visible to a stranger. Strangers saw the public face, the cold reserve, the careful formality, the eyes that assessed without warming, and they left Thornville Hall without having seen the man at all. This had not previously struck me as a great tragedy. I had worked for him long enough to understand that the right person, when the time came, would simply have the particular quality of patience and directness required to wait the public face out. Then Miss Elspeth Crane arrived. She came as a companion to Mrs. Phipps, a distant cousin of the Dowager Duchess, who had been invited for a fortnight in October. The visit was designed, I believe, as a gentle introduction to Mrs. Phipps's daughter, Miss Beatrice, who was young and pretty and unsuitable in ways the Dowager Duchess had not yet registered, but would eventually discern with her usual devastating accuracy. Miss Crane had been engaged by Mrs. Phipps as a companion and letter writer. She came from a family of gentle birth and reduced circumstances, and the position was a practical necessity. She had, I gathered, held similar positions for several years, and managed them with the composure of someone who had accepted the practical necessities of her situation, without allowing them to define the whole of who she was. She was 26 years old when she first walked through the doors of Thornville Hall, and she had the particular quiet composure of a woman who has learned to make herself useful without making herself conspicuous. She did not announce herself. She did not require the room to rearrange itself for her. She simply arrived and was present, and let the measure of who she was emerge from her conduct rather than from any performance of it. I noticed her at once. Not for any remarkable quality of appearance. She was pleasing to look at, with steady dark eyes and a way of holding herself that suggested both intelligence and self-possession. But there was nothing about her that called attention to itself. But because she was the only person in the entire Phipps party who looked at Thornville Hall itself with genuine interest. She paused in the entrance hall on her first morning, tilted her head back slightly to take in the plasterwork ceiling, and I saw something move through her expression that I can only describe as honest delight. Not the performed admiration of a woman cataloging a prospective family seat. Not a social display designed to be observed and approved. Something private and real and entirely not for anyone else's benefit. I made a mental note of it, in the way that stewards make mental notes of things that may not be relevant yet but are worth keeping. The Duke noticed her on the third day of the visit. I know this with certainty because I was in the room when it happened. He had come to the library in the mid-afternoon for a particular atlas he needed, one of the old estate maps, I believe, relating to a boundary question with a neighbor, and he found Miss Crane already there, sitting in the window seat with a book open on her lap and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. She had not heard him enter. She was absorbed in whatever she was reading, in the particular way of a person who is not performing their absorption but actually in it, and she was very still, and the afternoon light from the window came across her in a way that was, I admit, striking. He stopped inside the doorway. I was at the far end of the room, attending to some business with the ledger of new acquisitions, and I looked up at the sound of him entering and then looked at him and did not look away again. Because what happened to his face in that doorway was something I had not seen in 30 years of watching him. It rested. The public face, the careful, controlled, impenetrable expression that he carried everywhere outside the early mornings, and the private moments I have described, it simply dropped away. And what was underneath it was not something dramatic or legible. It was simply quieter and more genuine, the expression of a man who has walked, without intending to, into a place where he is permitted to be a person rather than a duke. He stood in the doorway for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, and then Miss Crane looked up, saw him, and began to rise. "Please don't," he said before she could stand. She settled back with the composure of a woman who has long practice at taking the unexpected in stride. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I should have asked permission to use the library. I did not think." "The library is not locked," he said. "If it were locked, it would mean I wished it kept private. As it is not, it means the opposite." She considered this for a moment, with the expression of a person receiving a statement and deciding whether she agrees with it. "That is a generous philosophy for a private library, Your Grace." "It is a practical one. Books are diminished by sitting unread." He crossed to the shelves and found his atlas. But I noticed, and I am trained to notice such things, and I remember it clearly now, that he did not immediately leave. He stood at the shelves for a moment longer than the task required, atlas in hand, and glanced once more toward the window seat. She had returned to her book and was paying him no visible attention. After a moment he left, and I looked back at my ledger, and I made a second mental note. He was back the following afternoon, and the one after that. Over the remaining 11 days of the Phipps party's visit, the Duke found occasion to speak with Miss Crane perhaps 6 or 7 times, in the library, twice in the garden when he came across her walking alone in the cold afternoon air, and once at dinner where some arrangement of guests placed them in proximity. He was not charming in any conventional sense. He did not deploy the social graces that other men used to recommend themselves to young women. He asked direct questions and gave direct answers, and offered none of the performative gallantry that the county's drawing rooms had taught him to recognize as the expected currency of such encounters. But he listened to her with a quality of attention that I had seen him apply to very few people. The complete, unguarded, slightly intense attention of a man who is actually interested, not performing interest, not conducting the social ritual of appearing engaged while cataloging the next remark, but genuinely following every sentence, thinking about it, waiting to see what came next. He was interested in what she thought and what she had read and what she made of things. This was not nothing for the Duke of Thornville. It was rather a great deal. She was not dazzled by him. That, I think, was the largest part of it. He was the Duke of Thornville, a title that produced a particular quality of anxious deference in most visitors, a slight tremor in voice and posture, and eye contact that the titled learn to discount and the untitled cannot always conceal. And she treated him with the same steady, direct courtesy she applied to everything and everyone. Not because she was performing insouciance, not because she was making a point, but because she was genuinely not afraid of him, and because she had learned, in a harder school than most, that a title on its own does not constitute a character. She found his tendency to argue from first principles in the middle of perfectly ordinary conversations, and instead of redirecting to safer social ground, she argued back. He was startled, then, visibly, challenged. Then something else, a quality of alertness, of engagement, as though someone had opened a window in a room that has been closed too long. She pointed out, one afternoon in the library, that a land management policy he had recently implemented on the South Fields was well-intentioned and likely to produce the opposite of its intended effect. And she laid out the reasons systematically and without apology, and with the light manner of a woman who expects to be contradicted and is perfectly ready for the contradiction. He did not contradict her. He listened to every word and then said, with the deliberate care of a man who does not easily change his mind and knows it, "You may be right." I had been his steward for 16 years at that point. I had never heard him say those words to a guest. She also, on one occasion, made him laugh. It happened in the garden on a cold afternoon in the middle of the second week, when they had fallen into conversation about a particularly unfortunate garden ornament that the late Duke had installed, and that the Dowager Duchess had never quite brought herself to remove, and Miss Crane offered, in 2 very dry and precise sentences, an analysis of the ornament's likely origins and its relationship to the aesthetic ambitions of the late Duke that was so accurate and so quietly absurd that the Duke laughed before he had made any decision to laugh. He looked slightly startled afterward, as a man does when he has done something he did not plan. She did not take credit for it. She moved on to the next topic, and he followed, and I thought from my position at a suitable distance, pretending to inspect the kitchen garden wall, that was it. There is the thing. I have been waiting to see what the thing would look like for quite some time, and that is it. She left with the Phipps party on a Tuesday morning in late October. It had rained in the night, and the drive was wet, and the carriage wheels cut long dark tracks through the gravel as it turned. The Duke watched the carriage go from the library window. I saw him standing there as I passed the open door, hands behind his back, quite still, and he watched it until it had turned into the lane and was entirely gone. Then he stood for a moment longer, looking at the empty gate. I brought his afternoon coffee at the usual hour. He drank it without speaking, which was not unusual. The quality of the silence was different from his usual silence, though. His usual silence was contained, purposeful, the silence of a man who is occupied with something. This was the silence of a man who has not yet decided what he is occupied with. After a longer pause than usual, he said, without looking at me, "Halford, what do we know of Miss Crane's family, the Cranes of Derbyshire?" "The late Mr. Thomas Crane of Ashbury, your grace," I said. "He left a widow and 2 daughters in reduced circumstances. The elder daughter, Miss Elspeth, has held companion positions for some 4 years. The younger daughter is married to a curate in Wiltshire." He was quiet again. "Reduced circumstances," he said, which was the phrase of a man turning something over in his mind and examining it carefully. "Yes, your grace." Another pause, then simply, "Thank you, Halford." He did not ask me to make further inquiries. He did not need to. I had worked for him long enough to understand that the asking of a question was, for a man of his particular nature, a very significant act, that he did not ask questions about things that were merely interesting, only about things that mattered, and that the things that mattered to him he held carefully, the way careful people handle fragile objects. I made the inquiries myself over the following month, quietly and without advertising what I was doing. I wrote to the solicitor who had managed the late Mr. Crane's estate. I made careful contact with the cousin in whose household Miss Crane had most recently been employed, who described her in terms that confirmed everything I had observed, and then added several further particulars I had not had occasion to see. I satisfied myself entirely on all the points that seemed relevant, and then, in December, through the Dowager Duchess, who received my suggestion with the contained excitement of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for 10 years, and is now engaged in the genuinely heroic effort of appearing to consider it at a normal pace. I arranged for Miss Elspeth Crane to be invited to Thornville Hall for the Christmas fortnight, in her own right, as a guest. She arrived on the 20th of December, on a late afternoon when the light was already going. The hall had been dressed for Christmas, boughs across the entrance hall and the upper landing, fires lit in every hearth, the particular smell of greenery and wood smoke, and winter that the hall only carries in December, and that I have always privately considered to be the best version of itself. The Dowager Duchess was in the drawing-room with the carefully arranged expression of a woman for whom this is all quite ordinary. Miss Crane came in out of the cold, her bag already in a footman's hands, and she stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and I watched her look up at the plasterwork ceiling, that same small automatic tilt of the head, that same honest, private delight, and something settled in me, the way things settle when a piece you have been looking for turns out to fit precisely where it should. What happened over that Christmas fortnight, and in the months that followed, belongs in outline here rather than in full detail, because the interior of it belonged to them and not to me. But I will say that it moved with a naturalness that I had not expected, given the deliberateness of the arrangement, and that I think it moved naturally because both of them were, by temperament, done with performance and simply ready for whatever was real. He took her riding on the second day. The ground was hard and the air was clear, and they went out for 2 hours and came back with muddy boots, and the Duke was in a better mood than I had seen in some time, and the Dowager Duchess, watching their return from the drawing-room window, made the small, satisfied sound of a woman whose scheme has produced its early indicators. He showed her the east wing, which was being replastered, and she stood in the dusty, unfinished room and told him precisely what she thought of both the original design and the new plan, and she was right about both, and he listened to every word and subsequently altered the new plan in 3 particulars she had identified, without ever making a point of having done so. She learned his library more thoroughly, its breadth, its organization, the evidence throughout of a mind that had been reading seriously for 20 years and was still doing it. She pulled a volume from the shelf one afternoon that she had read herself years earlier, and they talked about it for more than an hour, standing in the stacks, and when the conversation ended, there was a quality to the silence between them that had not been in the silence at the beginning of it. She also talked to the staff, in the way that some guests do and most do not. Not in any interrogative way, not in a way that was intended to signal her warmth, but simply because she was interested in the people around her and expressed it directly. The cook received her with the guarded suspicion she extended to everyone, and warmed by degrees over the course of the fortnight, until she gave Miss Crane a recipe that she had not given anyone in 14 years of my observation. The younger housemaids found reasons to be in rooms she was in. The old gardener, who had worked the grounds for 40 years and had views on the subject of visiting guests that were generally unfavorable, told me in passing that she was a sensible young woman and that there weren't many of those. I agreed with him and kept my own counsel. By February, he had spoken to the Dowager Duchess. By the end of March, he had requested a private meeting with Miss Crane. I did not hear what was said in his study on that Thursday morning, and I did not attempt to. I know only that she emerged with a composure that was, in my long-practiced reading of faces, very slightly disturbed, not by anything wrong, but by something right, something held carefully because she was not yet certain it would keep, and that 20 minutes after her, the Duke emerged with the expression of a man who has taken a step he had been approaching for months, and found that the ground, in fact, supports his weight. They were engaged before Easter. The announcement was made quietly, in keeping with both their natures. The county received it with the astonishment reserved for news that is both surprising and, on reflection, entirely inevitable. The Dowager Duchess received it with a relief so complete and so long deferred that she sat down and remained sitting for a quarter of an hour, which was not her habit, and which I pretended not to notice. Miss Crane's mother, the widow in Derbyshire, wrote a letter that was so carefully restrained in its happiness, and so warm beneath the restraint that the Duke, who had read it at his mother's urging, asked the Dowager Duchess to keep it, and she did, and I believe she keeps it still. Miss Crane came to the hall more freely now. She and the Dowager Duchess achieved a quiet understanding that seemed to require very little negotiation, which I attribute to the fact that they were both, at bottom, direct women who did not find deviousness efficient. She talked to the staff with the same unceremonious interest she had shown in December. She brought a quality to the rooms she occupied. I am not skilled at naming it, but I am skilled at noticing it, of inhabited warmth, as though the chairs were actually for sitting in and the fires were actually for warmth, and the whole large house was, for the first time in several years, being used for what houses are for. And then in the first week of May, the letter arrived. It was a clear, pale, early summer morning of the kind that makes Thornville Hall's grounds look exactly as beautiful as they are. I brought the morning post to the Duke's study at 9:30, as was my practice. He sorted through the letters with the efficient attention he gave to practical business, and he opened one that I did not recognize. No seal I knew, no hand I had seen before, and no indication on the outer paper that identified its origin. He read it. I was attending to something on the other side of the room and did not see his face as he read. But I heard him set the letter down in a particular way, not a decisive placement, not the ordinary sound of a letter being dealt with, but the careful, controlled sound of something being put down because the hands need to be free and the person is not yet sure what they will do with them. I turned. He was quite still. The letter lay face down on the desk before him. He was looking at the window at that clear May morning, with an expression I had never seen in 30 years of working beside him. Not anger, not grief. The moment before either of those, the expression of a man who has just received information that has altered the shape of everything, and whose body has not yet caught up to what his mind knows. "Halford," he said, his voice was perfectly controlled. "Your Grace, please send a note to Miss Crane's cousin's house. She is not to come to the hall today." She had been expected that afternoon. Thursdays had become her day. "Your Grace," I said, which was all I said. He paused, "and please arrange for her trunk to be sent from the hall to the station. She will be returning to Derbyshire." I stood very still. "Your Grace." He turned then, and his public face was entirely in place, impenetrable, cold, the expression that the county called feared, and that I, in 30 years, had come to understand was not coldness at all, but something like armor. The expression of a man who has decided it is not safe to feel. "The engagement is ended," he said. "Please see to it, Halford." He got up and left the study, and he did not discuss it with me again. Not that day, not the next, not in any of the 12 years that followed. Miss Elspeth Crane did not make a scene. I delivered the letter to her myself that afternoon, the Duke's brief, formal note, which said only that circumstances had arisen rendering the continuation of the engagement impossible, and that he wished her every happiness. I stood in the entrance hall of her cousin's house, a borrowed hall in a borrowed house, and I watched her read it. What I saw in her face is something I have thought about many times in the 12 years since. A moment of pure, unguarded shock, not performed shock, not the theatrical shock of a woman who expects to be observed in her distress, but the simple, raw expression of a person receiving the impossible. And then a stillness so complete that it was almost frightening, the way very quiet water can be frightening, because you cannot see the bottom. She read it a second time. She folded it along its original creases precisely as though precision mattered now. She set it on the side table. "Thank you, Halford," she said. Her voice was steady. "Please tell His Grace that I received his letter, and that I understand." I said, "Miss Crane, if there is anything—" "Thank you," she said, which closed the matter. She left for Derbyshire the following morning. Her cousin's housemaid told our footman that she had breakfasted alone and been dry-eyed throughout, and had thanked every member of the household individually before she went, that she had been unhurried, that you would not have known, to look at her, that anything was wrong. I put it away in the back of the cupboard, alongside everything else, and attended to my duties. I spent 12 years not knowing what the letter had said. I drew my own conclusions, as any person of ordinary intelligence would. An unsigned letter, an engagement ended without explanation in the space of a morning, the Duke's expression when he had set it down. I concluded, as I think was reasonable, that the letter had accused Miss Crane of something, and that the Duke had believed the accusation. What the accusation had been, I did not know. I thought about investigating, about making it my business to know, but the Duke had not asked me to know, and I had been trained for 30 years to the principle that what a man does not choose to share is not mine to pursue without invitation. I regret that training now, or rather, I regret the particular occasion on which I followed it. The training itself has generally served the Duke well. This was the exception, and I did not see it as an exception at the time, and I cannot undo it. What I could do, and did, was keep a quiet and general awareness of Miss Crane's situation. I heard in the months after her departure that she had taken a companion position in Yorkshire. I heard, a year later, that she had left that position. Several years after that, word reached me through the county's network of servants and lesser gentry, which is more efficient than most people imagine and carries more accurate information than most newspapers, that Miss Elspeth Crane had set herself up as a seamstress in a village called Kelwick in the north, that she worked hard, that she was steady and well regarded, that she was, by all available evidence, well. I kept this information, as I kept everything, in the back of the cupboard. The Duke, in the 12 years after the letter, was functional. I want to be precise about this, because there is a narrative about men like him, men of powerful feeling sealed behind a powerful reserve, that tends toward the dramatic, toward dissolution or isolation or visible ruin. He was none of those things. He managed the estate with the same competence and rigor he had always applied. He was not unkind to his tenants. If anything, in the years after the letter, his attention to their welfare became somewhat more deliberate, somewhat more detailed, as though he had resolved to be very thorough indeed about the things he could still do well. He engaged the drainage engineer who had been needed for the South Field for 3 years and kept being deferred. He commissioned a new school on the estate for the tenant children, a thing his father had spoken about and never done. He was present at every meeting of the land committee, which he had previously delegated. He worked with a particular focused energy in the first 2 or 3 years that I recognized, having seen versions of it before, as the productive expression of a grief that does not know what else to do with itself. He did not become reckless, or dissolute, or any of the other things that would have given the county a story to organize itself around. He was simply, in all the ways that mattered beyond the practical, behind glass. The warmth I had seen begin to emerge in the library, in the garden, in the sound of him laughing before he decided to, went back inside, and the door closed. Not loudly, just definitively. The way a room gets colder after a fire goes out, gradually, without drama, until you notice that you have been cold for some time and cannot recall when it started. He declined the county's social invitations, year after year, with courteous notes that gave no reason and required none. The Dowager Duchess tried twice more to raise the subject of a suitable match. The first time was in the 2nd year, when she invited a young woman of good family to stay for a week in October, without informing the Duke of her precise intention, and he was polite and entirely unreachable, and the young woman departed with the pleasant bewilderment of someone who has spent a week conversing with a closed door. The second time the Dowager Duchess tried was more direct. She sat with him after dinner one evening and said plainly that she wished to discuss his future, and he listened to her in full with the impenetrable courtesy that was his most impervious social tool, and he said that he appreciated her concern, and the subject was closed and did not reopen. She did not speak of Miss Crane, not to me, not in my hearing. I do not know what she knew, or suspected, or concluded. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she was not unobservant, and she had been in the hall when the engagement was made and in the hall when it ended, and she was not someone who failed to register the shape of things. But she was also a woman who understood the distinction between what she could address and what she could not, and she drew that line with precision and did not cross it. He read, he worked. He rode his land in the early mornings alone and came back with mud on his boots and the expression of a man who has spent an hour in his own company and has found it, as usual, sufficient and not enough. He kept the library exactly as it had been. I noticed this. He did not rearrange the books, did not shift the furniture, did not alter anything about the room that had been as it was on the afternoon she had sat in the window seat, and he had stopped in the doorway. The window seat had a cushion on it that she had adjusted once, and the cushion remained in exactly the same position for 12 years. I did not remark on this. It was not my place to remark on it. But I noticed, because stewards notice, and because the noticing of it told me something about the 12 years that nothing else could quite have said. He said one thing in all that time that has stayed with me. It was an evening in the 3rd or 4th year, when he had had rather more to drink than was his custom, not a great deal more. He was not a man given to excess, but enough to produce a slightly altered quality of stillness, more open, less managed. And he was sitting alone in the library with the fire going down and the room getting darker and a glass on the table beside him. He did not ask me to stay. He also did not send me away. I attended to a few small tasks in the room and waited to see what was needed. After a long silence, he said, without looking at me, studying the fire, "One makes decisions, Halford, and one must live in them." He was not talking about the estate. I said, "Yes, Your Grace," which was all I said, because there was nothing else to be said that was honest, and because I could not offer him anything useful without knowing what the decision had been, and because I did not know. I wish now, with the knowledge I have since acquired, that I had asked. I wish I had said, "What decision, Your Grace?" and let the question stand in the room until it was either answered or refused. I believe he might have told me. I believe on that particular evening, in that particular quality of tiredness, he might have been ready to tell someone. And if he had told me, I might have investigated. And if I had investigated, I might have found what I eventually found, and I might have delivered the truth a decade earlier than I delivered it. But I did not ask, and he did not tell me, and I have made my peace with this as best I can, which is to say imperfectly and finally. I wish I had known, but I did not. On the 1st of December, 12 years after the letter arrived, a boy of 17 came to Thornville Hall's back door at a little past 6 in the evening. His name was Robert Wick, and he was the grandson of a woman called Margaret Wick, who had been a housemaid at the Hall for the better part of 20 years before leaving service in the summer after the broken engagement. I had not connected those two facts, at the time, her departure and the broken engagement, and I reproach myself for it now, though I am not certain it would have made a difference. She had given notice in a perfectly ordinary way, and had taken up life in the village with a niece, and I had not thought about her since, except occasionally when reviewing old household records. Robert Wick stood in the back hall with his cap in his hands, and he said, "She's asking for the steward, my grandmother. She says she needs to tell you about a letter before she goes. She says she can't die proper without it." I went that same evening. The cottage was a mile from the hall, at the end of a lane that was muddy in December, and would have been difficult in the dark if I had not known the land well for 30 years. A small place, but warm inside, with a fire going in the main room and a good deal of effort visible in the neatness of it, the kind of neatness that speaks of a woman who has spent a lifetime keeping things in order, and has continued the habit into the room where she is dying, because it is the only habit she still has full command of. The sick-room smell was there underneath everything else, the particular smell that is not quite any one thing but is unmistakable for what it signals. She was in a narrow bed in a small room off the main, smaller than I remembered, which is what a long illness and 12 years will do to a person. She had been a capable, self-contained woman in her years at the Hall, competent, undemonstrative, good with detail, not given to sentiment or to any conspicuous attachment to the family she served. She had done her work well, and I had thought well of her, in the impersonal way that one thinks well of reliable employees who give no trouble and do not require management. Looking at her now, I thought, I did not know her at all, which is the thing that long service can do to you. If you are not careful, you mistake reliable for transparent and quiet for simple, and you miss what is underneath. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. She looked at me for a moment, and the expression in her face was, I am looking for the right word because I want to be accurate, raw, in the way that things are raw when they have been held under pressure for a very long time and the pressure is finally releasing. Not the relief of release, which can be warm. The other kind of release. The kind that hurts because the thing that has been held is finally letting go of you, and you feel every inch of the letting go. I wrote it, she said. She did not say what. She did not need to. The word letter was present between us before she could speak it, because it was the only thing that could explain why a dying woman had sent her grandson through a December evening to bring the steward of a house she had left 12 years ago. Tell me what it said, I said. She told me. All of it. She had accused Miss Elspeth Crane of improper conduct with a young man of the county, a man she named specifically, a man she had selected because he was real and known and far enough from the county to be unlikely to be quickly consulted. She had described alleged events with a detail she had spent time perfecting, dates, a location, a characterization of the young man's manner toward Miss Crane at a gathering the previous winter that she had invented from whole cloth, but rendered with the texture of observation. She had written the letter in a formal hand she had practiced for a week until it bore no resemblance to her own script. She had sealed it, addressed it, and posted it herself from a postal point in the next village on a Tuesday morning when she had told the senior housemaid she was visiting her niece. She had calculated the timing with precision, early enough that the Duke would receive it before the banns were called, late enough that the engagement had been public long enough to make its ending most damaging. She had known exactly what she was doing. When she finished, I said, "Why?" She was quiet for a long time. The fire shifted in the small hearth. Outside the window, the December dark had settled completely, and I was aware of the silence of the lane and the hall a mile away and the document I was going to carry back through the dark. "I fancied him," she said finally. I had fancied him a long time, years, from when he was 20 and I was new at the hall and hadn't yet learned the sense to know what it meant. It couldn't come to anything, I knew that. I was never a fool about what it was, but I'd learned to manage the knowing of it all those years. I'd learned to put it away every morning and take it out only when I was alone, and that had been sufficient. It had served. She paused. And then she came. She stopped for a moment and looked at the ceiling. She wasn't what I expected. I had seen him with women the Dowager Duchess had brought, lovely women, suitable women, and he was polite and empty, every one of them, and I had told myself he simply wasn't the kind of man I had told myself he was too private for it. That he would probably marry eventually for duty and it would be a practical thing and none of it would cost me very much. And then she came and she was nothing the other ones had been, and inside a week I could see, she stopped again. I could see that this was different, that she was different, that he was different when she was in the room, and I knew that she was going to have what I had spent 20 years not having, and I was. She stopped. The word that would have finished the sentence did not come. "I was angry," she said finally, "and frightened and very stupid." I said nothing. "I told myself it would come out," she said. "I genuinely believed it. I thought he would make inquiries. A man like that, careful about everything, careful about his land and his accounts and his tenants. I thought he would be careful about this too, that he would not simply believe an unsigned letter without confirming it. I thought the letter would unsettle things for a fortnight, and then he'd look into it and find it wasn't true and they'd sort themselves out, and I would have been very stupid and gained nothing except the relief of having done something with the feeling, with the—" She stopped. "He didn't make inquiries." "No," I said, "he didn't." She closed her eyes. The room was very quiet. "I knew," she said, "when she left. I knew by the way the house felt the morning after, the particular quiet of it. I knew by the look of Mrs. Phipps's footman when he brought her trunks down. He was a decent man, and decent people look a certain way when they are carrying something that should not be theirs to carry. I knew it was final." A pause. "I told myself it would sort itself, that he would come to his senses, or she would write and explain herself and he'd have to believe her over an anonymous letter. I told myself every version of this story in which everything came right in the end, and none of them happened. And then a year passed, and then 2, and then the longer it went on the less possible it became to." She stopped. "The longer you leave a thing, the heavier it gets, you know that." "I know it," I said. "I meant to write," she said. "I meant to write and say it wasn't true, a different letter unsigned to say. Disregard the first letter, it was a mistake, inquire if you wish to. I meant to do it for a long time. But I was afraid of being discovered, and I was ashamed, and I kept telling myself a little longer, and then—" She stopped. "There isn't a way to finish that sentence honestly." "No," I said, "I don't think there is." She had prepared a document. Her grandson had helped her draft it, she said, because her hands were too unsteady for a document of any length. It was plain in its language and precise in its particulars. Her full name, her years at the hall, the letter she had written, its complete contents. The name she had used, the method, the timing, the fact that every particular she had described was wholly fabricated, that Miss Elspeth Crane had been innocent of every charge, and that the document was offered as a voluntary confession in full knowledge of its implications. I held it steady while she signed it. Her hand trembled badly, but the signature was legible. I took it. I sat for a moment with the document in my hands, and I allowed myself to think about several things I might say to her. The anger was there, real and cold, not the hot anger of the immediate moment, but the cold kind, the kind that comes from understanding the full dimensions of a harm over time. I thought about the specific weight of what she had done. I thought about 12 years of a woman's life taken from a direction it should have had. I thought about a man who had closed himself behind glass and stayed there, and the cost of the staying. And then I thought about what a dying woman can carry, and what purpose is served by increasing that weight, and I set the thoughts aside. "Tell Miss Crane I'm sorry," she said. "I know it's nothing, I know it doesn't," she stopped. "Tell her anyway." "I will do what I can," I said. I rode back to Thornville Hall in the dark. I sat in the steward's office with the document before me and a candle burning lower than I noticed, and I let the facts arrange themselves into what they were, which took less time than I expected because the facts were simple. Then I went to find the Duke. He was in the library, past 10 o'clock, his reading chair, a book in his lap that I was fairly certain he had not been reading. The pages had not turned in the 20 minutes since I had last passed the open door. He looked up when I came in, and something in my face told him immediately that this was not routine business. I have worn many different expressions in 31 years, and I have considerable control over them. But there are limits to that control when the matter is of sufficient gravity, and this was well past those limits. "Halford, Your Grace, I need you to read something." I gave him the document. He took it and read it with complete stillness, his face giving nothing away, his eyes moving steady and deliberate down the page. He read with the thoroughness he gave to anything that mattered, not skimming, not checking for summary, but taking in every word and every particular as it was set down. He reached the end. He turned it over. There was nothing on the reverse side. He turned it back and read it again from the beginning. "When did she confess this?" he said. "This evening, Your Grace. She is dying. She wished to set the record straight before the end." He set the document very carefully on the side table beside him, aligning its edge precisely with the table's edge, which I recognized as the motion of a man who needs to do something with his hands, and has selected the most controlled option available. He looked at the window, the dark glass that showed him only his own reflection and the room behind him, nothing beyond, and he was very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. What came first in his face I did not expect. I had expected the anger, and the anger was there. I could see it building beneath the surface like weather moving in from the sea. The cold, contained, devastating anger of a man who has just understood the full shape of something that was done to him in the dark, without his knowledge, 12 years ago, and the cost of it, and the 12 years of cost that followed, and the fact that it was entirely unnecessary from the beginning right to the end. That anger was there, real and serious. But before it and underneath it, there was something else. The expression of a man who has been carrying something for 12 years without knowing its name, and has just been given the name, and who is now feeling all at once the full weight of it with the name attached. He covered his face with his hand. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It may have been longer. He took his hand down. He straightened in his chair. He picked up the document and read it a third time, slowly, and then he set it down on the table and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at me. "Where is she?" he said. "Miss Crane, Your Grace." "Yes." "She has been in a village in the north, Your Grace, a place called Kelwick. She works as a seamstress. By all I have been able to establish, she is well. She has been in Kelwick for some 7 or 8 years, I believe." He looked at me. "You know this." "I have kept a general awareness of her situation, Your Grace, at a distance. I considered it prudent to know in a general way that she was well." I paused. "I did not know the reason the engagement had ended, Your Grace. I had no basis to investigate further without your direction, and you gave me none." He was quiet. He looked at the document and then at the window. "She is well," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, by all accounts." He stood. He went to the window and stood looking out into the December dark, and I stood and waited, and after a silence that went on for some time he said, without looking at me, "I will ride to Kelwick in the morning." "Your Grace, Kelwick is 40 miles, and it is December." "In the morning," he said, which ended the discussion. I withdrew. I did not sleep. I sat in the steward's office with the document on the desk before me and the candle burning lower than I was noticing, and I sat with the long arithmetic of 12 years, and the particular and unanswerable question of whether 40 miles on a December morning would prove sufficient to reach what needed to be reached. I could not resolve that question. It was not mine to resolve. Eventually, I stopped trying and simply sat, and waited for the dark to change, which it eventually did, in the slow and reliable way that darkness always does. At a little before 5 in the morning, I heard the sound of boots on the back stair, the sound of a horse being led out from the stable. And then silence, and the hall settling around the silence, and the dark outside the window still complete, and nothing at all except the question of what 40 miles would reach and whether it would be enough. He arrived in Kelwick, I calculated later, sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning. 40 miles in 5 hours in December, on roads he did not know well in the dark for the first 3 hours of it, with no companion and no particular certainty of what he was riding toward. He found the seamstress's shop in the main street of the village. It was a small place, with a window displaying bolts of cloth and a workboard visible inside, lit from within by the morning light and a lamp on the counter. There was a name above the door that was not quite her own. A small, quiet alteration, either precautionary or proprietorial or both, the kind of adjustment a woman makes when she is building something entirely from her own hands and wants the thing to be entirely hers. He would have tied his horse at the post and stood for a moment looking at the name. Then he would have gone in. The bell above the door would have rung, the particular small bell that every shop has, announcing the ordinary commerce of ordinary mornings. And she would have looked up from whatever she was doing at the workboard, in the expected way, the way she had looked up from workboards in that shop for 7 or 8 years, preparing to greet a customer, and then she would have seen who it was. 12 years. She was 38 years old. She had made herself a life, not a large one, not the kind that announces itself, but a precise and cared-for one, built with the particular thoroughness of someone who has understood that they must build it themselves, and has decided to do so correctly. She was known in the village for the quality of her work, which was very high, and for the steadiness of her manner, which was the same steadiness she had always had, and for a dry, occasional humor that surfaces in competent people when they are not afraid of the company they are in. She was, by every account, well. She had not, from everything I could establish, become bitter. She was not built for bitterness, and she had enough practical sense to understand that bitterness is expensive and produces nothing and requires constant maintenance. But she had closed in the way that people close when they have received a wound they were never given the reason for, and the closing was its own kind of damage, quieter than bitterness, and harder to reach, because it does not announce itself. You can carry it for 12 years, and no one who does not know you well will see it, and even those who know you well will mostly only see it in the particular quality of your self-sufficiency, in the careful boundaries of what you allow yourself to want. He came in. She looked up and saw him, and there was a moment, I imagine it because I was not there, but I know both of them well enough to imagine it accurately, a moment in which both of them were simply stopped, in which 12 years were in the room in a way that filled it, the way cold fills a room in winter, not localized, not in any one corner, simply everywhere. He closed the door behind him. He would have told her, that is the kind of man he is, and it is the kind of thing he was. He would not have circled it, would not have approached it obliquely, would not have found a less direct path. He would have said plainly that he had learned something the previous evening that he needed her to know. He would have given her the document and waited while she read it, because she had the right to read it before he said anything else. And when she had read it, he would have confirmed what it said, that it was a confession, voluntarily given from a woman who had been in his household, and he would have told her that the letter she had never seen, the letter that had ended everything in 10 minutes 12 years ago, had accused her of something she had not done, and that the person who had written it had confessed to inventing it entirely. And then he would have said he was sorry. I do not know what she said in the minutes after that. I do not know the exact shape of those minutes, whether she stood very still or whether she sat, whether she wept or whether she was dry-eyed as she always was when things went wrong, whether she looked at him or at the document or at the window with its view of a December village street. I do not know which came first, the grief for what was lost, or the anger at the reason it was lost, or the particular complicated relief of having a name at last for something that had been nameless for 12 years. What I know is what the Duke told me, months later, sitting in the library in the quieter mood that had become habitual with him since her return. He told me she had asked him why he had not made inquiries, why he had believed an unsigned letter over his own judgment of a woman he had spent months coming to know. "What did you answer, Your Grace?" I asked. "Truth," he said. He was looking at the window, the way he always looked at the window when he was choosing words carefully. "That I had been afraid, that the letter had come at a moment when my fear was larger than my faith, and that believing it had been, in some part of me, some part I am not proud of, easier than the alternative, than the possibility of asking her and hearing something I could not receive, than the risk of discovering that the thing I had let myself want was built on something false." He was quiet for a moment. I told her that closing the door had seemed like the only response I had available in those 10 minutes, and that I had known for 12 years it was wrong, and that I had not found a way to address it because I did not know what address was possible without knowing the truth. I said, "And she?" He paused for a long time. "She said she had spent 12 years not understanding what had happened, that the not understanding had been the hardest part, harder in some ways than the thing itself, that there is a grief that knows its name and a grief that does not, and the second kind does not resolve because there is nothing for it to resolve against. It simply continues." He looked at his hands. "She said that now she had the name, that having it did not undo what was done, but that it was different to have it, that she could put it somewhere finally, that it had a shape now and she could hold the shape." He said nothing more. I did not ask for more. He stayed in Kelwick that day. He returned the following week, and the week after that. On the 4th visit he brought the Dowager Duchess, who had by then received the full account, and had expressed her views on Margaret Wick in language I will not reproduce, but that was both precise and comprehensive. She traveled north in December to a village seamstress's shop, and came back with the expression of a woman who has been looking for a particular thing for a very long time, and has finally, by the grace of a dying woman's conscience, found it. The announcement, when it came, was quiet. The county said a great deal, as it always does. Then, as it always does, it moved on, and in time the situation became simply the way things had always been, which is the kindest mercy counties extend. She came back to Thornville Hall on a Thursday in February, on a cold, bright morning when the grounds were hard with frost, and the light came off the ice in the pond at a low angle that made everything look very clean and very clear. I met her at the door, as was my place. She stepped out of the carriage and she stood in the entrance of Thornville Hall for the 3rd time in her life, the first as a companion in October, the second as an invited guest in December, and now as the woman who had come to live here, and she looked up at the plasterwork ceiling, and she tilted her head back very slightly and took it in. The expression on her face was exactly the same as it had been the first time and the second, that honest, private, unperformed delight, not triumphant, not constructed for anyone's observation. Simply real in the way that only real things are real, the things that don't change according to circumstance, because they are not dependent on circumstance. I had been afraid, in some part of my mind, that she would come back different. That 12 years and the particular weight of what had been done to her would have altered her in some fundamental way, made her cautious, made her armored, given her the quality I had seen in other people who had been wronged and recovered. A quality of watchfulness, of taking everything with a slight reserve, as though the world might be about to take something again and they would prefer to be braced for it. I would not have blamed her for it. I had seen worse responses to less cause. She had not come back different. She had come back changed, which is not the same thing. Changed in the way that good material changes when it has been worked, not weaker, not harder in a brittle sense, but firmer in its grain, clearer in its structure, more certainly itself than it was before. She was not the same woman she had been at 26. She was more, and the more was made partly of what had been taken from her and partly of what she had built in its place, and it gave her a quality that 26-year-old ease and brightness does not yet have, the quality of having tested her own self-possession against something real and found that it holds. She brought it into the hall, that quality. It settled into rooms she occupied. The fires seemed actually warm when she was in them. The chairs were for sitting, and the windows were for looking out of, and the whole large house that had been managed for 12 years with great competence and something very slightly short of life became, over the course of the months after her return, a place where people lived. She changed things, not by announcement but by attention. She noticed the cook's difficulty with the kitchen's storage arrangements, and offered a practical suggestion that the cook implemented without any ceremony, in the way of people who are grateful to be understood and too proud to make a point of the gratitude. She noticed the youngest housemaid's trouble with reading and arranged, quietly, for someone from the village to help her with it. She noticed the groundskeeper's bad knee and ensured, before the heaviest work of the autumn, that it was redistributed without requiring him to ask, which would have cost him more than the redistribution saved. She talked to the tenants on the south side of the estate where the Duke's recent land policy had been, as she had told him years ago in the library, well-intentioned and likely to produce the opposite of its intent. And where I now noticed, looking at the records, the policy had in fact been quietly revised in the years since, which I had not previously connected to that afternoon's conversation. None of this was announced. It simply happened, and then it was simply how things were, which is the best way for things to happen and the hardest to arrange. He was not a different man. He was still the Duke of Thornville, still contained, still rigorous, still more comfortable with the horses in his stables than with the drawing rooms of the county, still disposed to argue from first principles in the middle of ordinary conversations in a way that most people found difficult to keep up with, and that she did not find difficult at all. But there was a change in the quality of his reserve, not in its presence, which was structural in him and would always be there, but in what it was for. It was no longer the reserve of a man keeping the world out because the world might deliver something he could not receive. It was the reserve of a man who had chosen his enclosures deliberately and could leave them when he wished to. He was present. In a way he had not been for 12 years present. And presence, I have come to believe, in 31 years of watching people, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, rather close to the whole thing. They spent their evenings mostly in the library. She in the window seat with her book and her tea, always the same cup, always grown slightly cold, because she became absorbed in things and forgot to drink, and he at his desk with his papers or in the reading chair with his book, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they were quiet, and neither required the other to be anything other than what they were. It was not the brightness of first discovery. That quality was gone, and pretending otherwise would have been a kind of untruth about what it had cost them to be here. What it was instead was something that I believe does not have a name in the vocabulary most people use, because most people do not have occasion to need a name for it, the warmth of something that has been tested and has held, which is not the same as untested warmth, and which is not inferior to it, which is, in some ways I find difficult to articulate and will not try too hard to articulate more than it. I set this down now because I am old, and old men who have kept careful records of other people's lives sometimes feel, toward the end, the need to enter one record that was never properly kept. This is mine. For 12 years I did not know what the letter had said, and I cannot undo that not knowing. I have turned it over many times in the quiet of the evenings I now have rather more of than I used to, looking for the moment when a different choice would have changed the direction, when a question asked or an inquiry made would have cracked the thing open and let the light into it before 12 years had passed. I have found several such moments. I have allowed myself to regret each of them briefly, with the specific and uncomfortable clarity that late life tends to bring to such things, and then I have set them aside, because regret without the capacity to alter anything is not a useful occupation, and I was trained for useful occupations. What I have not been able to set aside, and do not in the end wish to, is this. A woman of intelligence and dignity and quiet strength was given a wound she had not earned and was not given any reason for it, and she carried it for 12 years without asking anyone else to share the weight. She did not collapse under it. She did not let it make her bitter or closed in any of the destructive ways that such wounds can close a person. She built something out of the endurance, something small and precise and genuinely hers, and she held on to herself and she went on. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a very large one, and it deserves to be stated plainly and clearly in any account of these events. The man who caused the wound had his reasons. They were human reasons, which is to say they were understandable in the way that most human failures are understandable when you look at them long enough and with enough honesty. He was afraid, at a moment when fear was larger than faith, and he made a choice in 10 minutes that cost them both 12 years. He has known this, I believe, for most of those 12 years, even without knowing the full truth of it. And he has had to live in the knowledge, and he has done so, and that has its own cost, and I do not minimize it. A dying woman's conscience, arriving in December at nearly the last possible moment, was sufficient to set a 40-mile road in front of a man who had been standing still for a very long time. I find this the sheer contingency of it, the fact that the truth arrived at all, that it arrived in time, that it arrived when and how it did, something I cannot quite accommodate into any very orderly view of the world. I have tried, and I cannot. I simply note it, and I am grateful for it, and I let it be what it is, which is perhaps all one can do with such things. I delivered the truth. That is the whole of my role in this account. I rode through the dark on a December night, and I handed a document to the man who needed it, and the rest was theirs to accept or refuse, and they did not refuse it. They were, both of them, the same people they had always been. The same serious, composed, quietly stubborn people who had stood in a library and argued about a book and found, without planning to or expecting to, that they were each precisely what the other had been looking for. 12 years of wrong does not diminish that kind of thing. It is either real or it is not. And if it is real, it is more durable than you would think, and it asks less of circumstance than most things do. The detail I return to most often is this. Some weeks after her return, I had occasion to bring the morning post to the library. I came in quietly, as I have come in quietly for 31 years, announcing myself just enough to be expected, and I set the post on the table, and I was about to withdraw when I noticed that the Duke was not looking at his papers. He was looking at her. She was in the window seat, her book open on her lap, her tea at her elbow, the morning light coming through the glass at the angle it always comes through that window in February, clear and honest and without particular warmth. He had forgotten, or decided not to bother, to arrange his face into anything at all. He was simply looking, with the private and entirely unguarded expression of a man who is glad that the person in the window seat is there, and who has, for this moment at least, stopped managing whether anyone can see that he is glad. She must have felt the attention because she looked up from her book. She caught his eye. Something passed between them, the sort of thing that has no words left to require, because the words were said in a small room in a village 40 miles north. And what is left now is simply the fact of being in the same room together, and not requiring the distance that used to be necessary, and neither of them finding that remarkable, because it has become already simply the way things are. She looked back at her book. He looked back at his papers. I withdrew. I am a man of 31 years of careful, discreet, professional observation, and I am very clear on what I saw, and I carry it differently from the other things I carry. Not in the back of the cupboard where things go to be stored and occasionally forgotten, but somewhere accessible, somewhere close, somewhere I can take it out on a December evening and hold it for a moment and know that it is real. She is in the window seat. That is the whole of it, and it is everything,